I want to address a question that is almost unanswerable, or at least it's practically unanswerable in any finite time frame. But it's such an important question, as well as a difficult one, that, we ought to do it even though we ought to hesitate. What is the question, Scott? The question is, why is it in Deuteronomy 20, especially verse 17, we have a law that requires the Israelites to slaughter the Canaanites? Not just the soldiers, the men, women, and children, the cities as well. How do we even begin to wrap our minds and hearts around that? How do we even begin to address that when it just seems to be so arbitrary, so ruthless, so genocidal, so similar to the kind of terrorism that we would condemn as a kind of jihad that is wrong? Well, you can see why I'm hesitant, because it really does require a great deal of care in addressing it, a number of distinctions that need to be made. But what I'd like to do preliminarily is just to conduct a brief thought experiment, because this is, I think, the passage through which we can enter into an authentic answer. So here I am in the St. Paul Center studio, and suppose I leave and get back home and I find out that my family house is occupied by a violent gang. And I can see through the front door the fact that Kimberly has been captured, that the house has been taken over, that the kids, in fact, are tied up and their lives are being threatened. What should I do? Well, in this thought experiment, I think the first option would be I would try to talk them out of this. I might stand up on the front yard and preach the gospel and urge them to consider repenting and to consider what they're doing in the light of eternity. But the fact is, most likely, I will not succeed in that venture. And so what would the second option be? Well, to resort to force. Well, how much force? Whatever it takes. Lethal force? If my loved ones' lives are at stake. Yeah, Jesus says turn the other cheek, but he doesn't say turn your kids' other cheeks. And so I should take action. A shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and the wolves as well. He lays their lives down. And so if I couldn't persuade them to repent and come out voluntarily, I could force them to do so involuntarily with the help of the police. And so what difference does this make? What is the possible relevance of this for the question? Well, this is something that is buried in a certain way from us 2,000 years after the coming of Christ, but it's 2,000 years more after Abraham. 4,000 years ago, the patriarch Abraham is called in Genesis 12 to leave the land where he had grown up, Ur of the Chaldees, to go to the land that the Lord would show him. Why? Because it's the promised land. It's your inheritance. And so he set out to go where? We're not told exactly how he knew, but he knew where and how to get there. And why? Well, again, you have to kind of do a bit of excavating, not just exegeting the text, but going back to Genesis 11, the preceding chapter, you can see how the big human family that is described in Genesis 10, the table of nations, all 70 nations are descended from Noah and his 3 sons, are divided by the Tower of Babel and by the pride and the arrogance of the Babel builders, the tower builders there at Babel. And so what God is doing, in effect, is planning to bless all the nations. He's planning to reunite them all after he had to scatter them because of their pride and disobedience. So if we took a close look at the table of nations, we would see that the 70 nations are described in terms of geography. This is not something that would leap off the page for anybody today. But, if I described, the geography of Canada and Mexico, I would draw your eye to the center, which is America. If I described Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Indiana, I might then draw your eyes more closely to Ohio. If I were to mention Pittsburgh and Weirton and Wintersville, I could draw you to the center of my mental map, which would be Steubenville. But of course, most of you don't know those cities, but those who do would find it pretty easy. Well, the map that is drawn in Genesis 10, the so-called Table of Nations, is meant to draw your eye to the center of the earth, because it is a kind of mappa mundi in the Latin, the map of the world. And there in the center is the land that was intended by God through Noah for his firstborn, Shem, and all of his descendants. We call them Semitic people. And especially Shem's great-grandson, Eber, who's the founding father of all of the Hebrews. So this was the Hebrew land intended by God through Noah for the Semitic and the Hebrew people. And who is Abraham? In Genesis 14, he's called Abram the Hebrew. And so what is this land? It's meant to be Shem land. But what has happened? Ham, who's disobedient, and his accursed son Canaan have basically poached the land. They have taken it over. Like a violent and perverse gang, they have occupied this territory for quite some time. And so, what does God ask Abram to do? To step out by faith, to go to that promised land, and to wait upon the Lord. Now, we have to press the fast forward button, because by the time Abraham's descendants came out of Egypt 4 centuries later, they were marching to the promised land. But halfway there, they stopped at Sinai and they get the law. And of course, we know the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, but we also discover additional laws in Exodus 21, 22, and 23. We call it the Covenant Code. And God is very explicit as he is giving the law in the midst of this theophany, the thunder and the lightning and the fire and the smoke atop Mount Sinai. And he says, you're going to go into the land of Canaan, but do not do what the Canaanites do, because the Canaanites are idolatrous. They're impure. They're violent. They're perverse. And no wonder, because you go back to Genesis 9 and you discover the origins of Canaan. He was birthed through an act of maternal incest. More on that later. In fact, maternal incestuous rape. So what is happening at Sinai is God saying, do not enter into covenants with Canaanites. Do not enter into any sort of marriage either with them. Instead, you are to convert them. Well, what were the chances of unfaithful Israel of converting the Canaanites? Well, 40 years later, it became pretty obvious that Israel was not likely to convert the Canaanites. If anything, the Canaanites were likely to pervert the Israelites because of their own unbelief. So 40 years later, in Deuteronomy, as I mentioned, this law is only found in Deuteronomy 20, verse 17. You go back 40 years all the way to the law that God gave to Israel at Sinai, and the only commandment regarding the Canaanites was don't marry them, don't enter into covenants with them, because you'll have to invoke the names of their false gods, which is idolatrous. 40 years later, after Israel has committed infidelities and disobedient transgressions for an entire generation, we have a different law. What do we call it? The second law, literally Deuteronomy. It's given by Moses, not by God. There are no theophanies. In fact, Deuteronomy actually refers to itself as the book of the Torah, or law of Moses, as distinct from the first 4 books. And Orthodox rabbis notice this distinction, that the book of the Torah of Moses is precisely Deuteronomy. And Jesus is referring to this in Matthew 19 when he says, Moses permitted divorce and remarriage because of the hardness of your heart. You go back 40 years to Exodus at Mount Sinai, and when God gave the law directly to Israel, there was no concession or permission for divorce and remarriage. Only in Deuteronomy chapter 24, by way of concession to the hardness of Israel's hearts. Now wait, go back 40 years to Exodus. Who was characterized by having a hardened heart? That's Pharaoh. 40 years later, who has a hardened heart? Israel. It's a lot easier to take Israel out of Egypt than it is to take Egypt out of Israel and Israel's heart. And so Moses is allowed by God in the inspired book of Deuteronomy to give concessionary laws. And as Maimonides and St. Thomas Aquinas point out, quoting Aristotle, that the wise and prudent lawgiver has to tolerate lesser evils in order to avoid greater evils. To avoid the greater evil of killing your old spouse because you can't marry a young one, divorce and remarriage was permitted. And likewise, in order to avoid being perverted by the Canaanites, you're not going to convert them. They've been given 40 years of notice to get off the land that wasn't theirs, that they know to be yours, going back many, many centuries, all the way to Noah, Shem, and Eber, the Hebrews. Basically, Moses is saying, if you can't convert them, you must destroy them. They've had enough time to leave voluntarily. If they won't, they're going to have to be defeated. They're going to have to be destroyed. This is the thought experiment that I wanted to conduct in a preliminary way. You can find this in a book called Jubilees, also known as the Mini Genesis. About 14 or 15 copies of Jubilees were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's basically a commentary on Genesis and Exodus that is very ancient. But it excavates, it digs up this ancient interpretive tradition better than anything else I know. In fact, it's in the Ethiopian Jewish Old Testament canon. If you look at the Ethiopian Christian Church, it also is in their Old Testament canon. In the Book of Jubilees, which is also available online in translation, only available in its original form in Ethiopic, check out chapters 8, 9, and 10, because all of this is spelled out. What is implicit in Genesis 9, 10, 11, and 12, what is implied by what we see in Deuteronomy in contrast to the laws that God directly gave to Israel at Mount Sinai, all of this is made explicit and emphatically clear in Jubilees chapters 8, 9, and 10. Now, this doesn't belong in our Bible, but it does help us by illuminating or shedding light on these obscure parts of the Old Testament. And St. Epiphanius, among other saints, utilized the Book of Jubilees. It was lost for nearly 2,000 years, and in the 1800s it was sort of recovered through direct contact with the Ethiopian Jewish and Christian communities. This book is not the peg on which I hang all of this, because I really came to this thought experiment. I came to this set of conclusions. I came to this hypothesis before I realized that Jubilees chapters 8 through 10 clarifies all of this. And by the way, the Book of Jubilees is only 50 chapters long, a lot like Genesis. That's why it's called the Mini Genesis. But it takes us all the way from creation to Exodus 24 to show that the cycle of Jubilees every 50 years leads us precisely to when God brought Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus, to take them into the promised land, the ancestral inheritance. Why? Because what does the year of Jubilee celebrate? You get your land back every 50 years. Your debts are forgiven, slaves are set free, but whether you had to leave the land or just lease it, you get your land back, so you cannot alienate future generations of your family from that land that is so sacred. Well, if that was true for a chunk of real estate for the 12 tribes of Israel, how much truer is it for the ancestral inheritance of Israel that goes back, as I said, to Noah, to Shem and the Semitic people, and to Eber and the Hebrews? Okay, so Chesterton once said, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Well, I suspect that you might feel like I have done that. But a first try is always necessary. And then what I hope to do in the future is to come back again and again, because there are a number of other passages, especially the drunkenness of Noah and the curse on Canaan in Genesis 9, where I'd like to show you what Dr. Bergsma and I have demonstrated in an article, where you can see how it is that Canaan is born as a result of an act of immoral, maternal, incestuous rape. And also other passages in Leviticus 18 and 20. But I'm going to have to stop now and just say that this thought experiment has been brought to you by the St. Paul Center. And we're always kind of looking for answers to the tough questions. And so we've only begun to excavate. We've only begun to dig up some of these portions of the scriptures and the ancient interpretive traditions that are shared by the Jewish and the Christian communities of antiquity. So stay with us, because in the future we're going to expand upon this greatly. Take care, and God bless you.